Good afternoon or good morning, based on wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining our webinar today. I hope that you all can hear me well. Let us know if you don't. You all are on mute, so please use the question box on the side of the screen to let us know if you have any questions or comments. My name is Rathin Sinha. I am the founder of JOBfindah Network and the moderator for today's webinar. I will introduce our guest speaker, Matt Nusbaum, and if time permits, we will take questions in the end. First, a few logistical items. You can either use your computer or your phone for audio. The call-in numbers are shown on the right side of the screen under Dashboard, or simply dial 1-562-247-8422, participant code 174348298, and this should be in your invite as well. We will have a recording available by the end of tomorrow. A PDF of the presentation will also be sent to you. Please add contact@jobfindah.com or webinars@jobfindah.com to your safe email list. This webinar is approved for 1 hour of credit by HRCI. We will have the details on how to get the credit in an email to all the attendees. As I said, we'll answer any questions at the end. Please submit any questions to us using the question box. Today's webinar is hosted by JOBfindah. Businesses nationwide use JOBfindah for easy-to-use job posting, distribution, outreach, and reporting for federal contractor OFCCP compliance and diversity recruiting results. Businesses use us for OFCCP compliant recruiting, for diversity outreach, for diversity and workforce recruiting, and reports, documentation, and support in case of an audit. Our topic today is how to talk about affirmative action. Affirmative action is essential for building a diverse and inclusive workforce, and it is mandatory for regulatory OFCCP compliance for organizations that do business directly or indirectly with the federal government. However, negative connotations often accompany the term affirmative action, and headlines tend to focus on unlawful quotas, set-asides, point systems that make some people believe that affirmative action is about taking something from one group and giving it to another. However, the purpose of affirmative action is exactly the opposite. This session focuses on the language that HR leaders should use when discussing affirmative action. How leaders talk about it matters, and they have to include everyone in the conversation to overcome any resistance. Next slide. Our speaker, Matt Nusbaum, is the director of BCGi Institute for Workforce Development at Biddle Consulting Group. As you can see, BCGi is really an education and training arm of the Biddle Consulting Group. Some of you know about Biddle Consulting Group. It's a first of its kind. It's a free online compliance encyclopedia. Tools, guides, templates, checklists that are actually useful that you can find there. Also, they have all new training library with an all new approach. I encourage you to check it out. Now, going back to Matt, our speaker, he consults federal contractor employers regarding the non-discrimination and affirmative action requirements enforced by the OFCCP of the US Department of Labor. He also regularly consults on other related labor and employment law requirements. Matt has, as you can see, about a decade of related, experience. He's a practicing, a lawyer. He practiced law in New York and the Washington, D.C. for about 10 years. He's big on data analysis and computer programming, obviously database design, implementation, management. As Matt would like to call himself, he's a plumber who never met a toilet that he couldn't fix. So now, without further ado, let me hand it over to our speaker, Matthew Nusbaum. It's all yours, Matt.
Thank you, Ratin. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And yes, before becoming an attorney many, many moons ago, I managed the plumbing department of a large hardware store. So feel free to ask me your plumbing questions as well. But for now, welcome to How to Talk About Affirmative Action, subtitled Where to Start and How to Drive Success. As he mentioned, I'm the director of something we call BCGi. That stands for the Biddle Consulting Group Institute for Workforce Development, which is a mouthful, and now you know why we just call it BCGi. This is also where I tell you I am an attorney, but I am not your attorney. So please do not construe anything I say today as legal advice, disclaimer, disclaimer. But I'm sick and tired of beating my head against a wall trying to get people to understand affirmative action using the same language and methods that have failed us so far. And I'm sick and tired of ignorant, uninformed people leading the conversation. I'm not talking about us. I'm talking about Jimmy down at the bar or Ethan down at the farmer's market. We'll talk about those two yahoos in just a bit. But when we get together as an industry, we tend to talk about how to do the stuff we have to do. We obsess over what the EEOC and the OFCCP are up to. Maybe we talk about legal strategies and such, but it seems like we hardly ever talk about something that is or should be central to our function, and that is talking about affirmative action. We know what we're supposed to do, but when are we supposed to learn about how to talk to other people about what we do? The original subtitle for this presentation was Because You're Probably Doing It Wrong. Ratin thought where to start and how to drive success was more positive, so we went with that. But my original subtitle was not because I think you personally have been doing it wrong, but because I think we all have for the last half century or so. And if there's one thing, if there's one thing the last several years should have taught us in the EEO and AA space, it's that our communication about affirmative action has to change. Are we going to solve all of society's ills today? No. Are we going to address every possible nuance in this area? Well, probably not. But I do hope that we walk away from this with a few more tools in our toolbox when it comes to having real conversations with real people about affirmative action. Now, I'm going to disappear behind my slide deck here so you don't have to look at me the entire time, and we'll jump right in. All right, look, some people are just super resistant to the principles of non-discrimination, and that can be difficult to deal with. We often talk in terms of being on the bus, don't we? People are either on board, they're on the bus, or they're not. Sometimes we'll use a train analogy and say that the train is pulling out of the station and you're either on board or you'll be left behind. And that's easier than having hard conversations with actual people, isn't it? After all, non-discrimination is the law, so there's really no debate. Just tell people that they're required to, what they're required to do or not do, and tell them to get on board. Trouble is, what we've seen is that it doesn't take too many of those people to derail the whole train. They've been derailing it the entire time, we just haven't recognized it. They're out there in our organizations, in positions of authority, actively circumventing the carefully worded policies and meticulously developed practices meant to be the dragnet we use for catching the bad stuff people do. Some are doing it out of spite, some are doing it out of fear, Some are doing it because they truly believe that affirmative action is an evil and they are doing good work in fighting against it. But the one thing all of them have in common is that none of them have any real clue about what your affirmative action program is all about. Worse, actually, it's not that they have no idea, it's that they have the exact wrong idea. And we can spread the blame around for that quite a lot, but we can't remove ourselves from that picture. As compliance professionals, most often HR and legal professionals, it is literally our job to have the hard conversations that no one else wants to have, and to deal with the difficult personalities in our workplaces that no one else wants to deal with. Like it or not, we have to find a productive way to bring, let's call them the non-discrimination hesitant, back into the fold and back into the conversation. Now, let me be clear, that doesn't mean coddling anyone. The law is still the law. Company policy is still to obey the law, and there are still consequences for violating company policy. So there's always that stick in your hand, and it's still okay for people to see it and know that it's there, but it's not enough. We have to address their concerns, no matter what we might think of any particular concern that gets thrown our way. And that's what this presentation is about, addressing the elephants in the room, but we'll get to all of that. Nor does it mean letting people get up on a soapbox in the break room and yell at people. If you're a government agency, there are potential free speech issues, but otherwise, you don't have any constitutionally protected right to free speech on the grounds of a private employer. So rabble-rousers can still be disciplined, even in jurisdictions that protect political speech. It does mean, however, talking to them in a way they can understand, which is to say, a way people can understand. That doesn't mean dumbing things down or anything like that. It means I don't think we've been communicating in language that anyone who doesn't have a law degree has any hope of truly comprehending. And even most of the people with law degrees don't really understand this stuff, to be honest. Another alternate subtitle for this presentation is a no BS conversation about affirmative action, because I see a lot of BS in this space, and I bet you do too, because most people have pretty fine-tuned BS detectors. Yet we still try to BS our way through this stuff. I've seen the trainings. Hell, I'm guilty of putting on some of those trainings at past organizations because they wouldn't let me say what I really wanted to say. These trainings say things like, affirmative action is not quotas. BS. Excuse me, but that's BS. You know it, I know it, and your employees know it. What we're trying to do is distinguish between forms or types of affirmative action and assure people that our affirmative action program is not about implementing things like quotas or point systems or set-asides and such. But we're never going to get that message across because we just lost our credibility with that BS. We have to call things what they are. And if we don't have the right terms handed to us, we have to find them on our own. And we're going to get to that in just a bit too. But most of us are in human resources. Think about that term for just a little bit. I'm not entirely sure why we stopped using the term personnel, but we actually managed to land on a somewhat dehumanizing term for the most human function our organizations have. And somewhere in there, we lost sight of the fact that it's our job to deal with people. And those people are just like us, our family members, our neighbors. And just like the rest of us, they want to be talked to, not at. That doesn't mean abandoning your authority, by the way, which is also something we're going to talk about. Establishing your authority is absolutely critical, but within that framework, we still have to be able to address human issues, primarily fear. Now, I'm originally from Kansas, so from one Midwesterner to the others out there, I know many of you understand what I mean when I say people value being a straight shooter, right? No matter where you're from, being called a straight shooter is a compliment. It has nothing to do with your rifle skills, though those might be prized as well. It has everything to do with speaking the truth, preferably unvarnished. For pretty much everyone, unvarnished truth is pretty impactful. It can also be hurtful, but it doesn't have to be unkind. For instance, you'll hear me describe our job in compliance as making sure the playing field is even and keeping it that way for everyone. That's our mission in a nutshell. And sometimes I have to be frank with someone who truly believes they are of a race touched by God. And it can be incredibly effective to ask them a simple question. What are you so afraid of? My job here is to make sure the playing field is even so that no one has an unfair advantage or disadvantage and will be judged, win or lose, based on the merits. That's my promise to you. The fight will be fair. I would think that you would welcome the opportunity to stand toe-to-toe with other people and prove just how superior you are. But if you can't win on an open playing field and you get beat fair and square, well, I don't know what to tell you, but maybe you should reconsider that whole supremacy thing. Hurtful? Maybe a bit. Impactful? You bet. Unkind? I argue not. If you're going to fly a flag proclaiming you're superior to other people, I don't think you can characterize it as unkind if I ask you to put your money where your mouth is. But that's an extreme example. Hopefully, you won't be constantly dealing with person after person who longs for the Confederacy. Instead, you're going to deal with a mixed bag, and it's always a mixed bag, whether people let you know it or not. So we need an approach that speaks to the entire spectrum. And I think that approach needs to involve straight talk. Let me share a quick story before I go to the next slide. Several years back, I was brought in to talk to a room full of about 30 managers at a waste hauling facility, 29 men and one woman, all in middle age, all sitting with their arms crossed with a scowl on their face. One of them was particularly torqued about having to sit through this affirmative action training BS. Now, before we began, he got up and pulled the head of compliance aside and told him in no uncertain terms that he would be damned if he was going to sit there and be lectured to about affirmative action by that pipsqueak, pointing at me. And as the pipsqueak in question, I smiled and waved and pantomimed that we're going to start in about 2 minutes. Now, the head of compliance rather firmly explained to this gentleman that he had two choices. He could either sit back down and be polite, or they could continue the conversation back in the HR offices. And he reluctantly sat down, but it was pretty clear that he was not alone. He was just the one willing to stand up and make a fuss. So I had what you might describe as a hostile audience. I asked them to pay attention and give me a chance. And if this wasn't unlike any previous training they ever sat through, I'd give them their money back. Now, they thought I meant that I would give the company their money back. No, I meant I would give them individually their money back, which was exactly $0. But I was happy to let them think otherwise because it caused many of them to actually pay attention, thinking they were going to catch me out giving the same old training and be the hero that got the company's money refunded. And then I began my show, and I could see that I had their attention pretty much from jump because in fact, no one had ever talked to them about affirmative action the way I did that day. There were the occasional chuckles, there was some squirming, but when the lights came back up, all eyes were staring straight ahead. And 6 of those 30 stuck around afterward to tell me personally that until they saw that presentation, they thought this was all a crock of, well, shit. Pardon my language there, I don't mean to offend, but these were waste hauling managers, and that's the language they used. In the span of about an hour, they went from crock of shit to wanting to talk about it more. And I stuck around for 2 hours after that presentation answering questions. Now, I didn't reach everyone, I know that, but everyone did see the enthusiasm of those 6 and the dozen or so that stuck around to continue the conversation. And I have no doubt that the experience stuck with them. So I'm telling you that this can work. Straight talk is something most people are hungry for, but never get. So when they do, they tend to sit up and listen. Now, straight talk means a few things. For one thing, we're going to minimize legal speak. Legalese can be helpful if you're a lawyer interacting with another lawyer or someone just trying to sound smart. Otherwise, it tends to get in the way of any meaningful understanding. Unless you're a Latin scholar, a lot of those words aren't going to make sense to you, and the person using them is just going to come off sounding snooty. For another, it means using plain language normal people actually use. We tend to think that the lawyers who wrote our policies and statements and such are privy to magic words that must be used for some reason. And if you ever find yourself talking to an employee about affirmative action and saying something like affirmative action requirements for qualifying federal contractor employers, because you think you need to be that specific, go ahead and check that assumption for me. Who are we clarifying for here exactly? And for me, it also means avoiding using business speak. That's a crutch on the one hand. On the other, it marks people as in the club or not, and I don't like doing that. And if I had a third hand, I'd hold up a word like synergy and admit that I still don't know precisely what that means. I just want to have a conversation where everyone is talking like a normal person. But most importantly, I'm not afraid to talk about the things people don't usually talk about, using terms that can make some people uncomfortable. I'm going to try to be respectful. For instance, I prefer to refer to minorities in the aggregate as people of color, because the term minority can be both misleading and derogatory. You can call that political correctness if you like. I call it being polite, and I will be polite like that, but I'm not going to sugarcoat things for anyone. Now, the first question I tend to get when I train is, who the heck is this guy? Who is this pipsqueak telling me what's what? I'm an expert. Now, I know the value of expertise seems to have eroded recently, but people really need to consider their sources. This is what I do. This is pretty much all I think about. This is what I study. This is what I practice. And this is why I'm not very popular at cocktail parties. But here's the kicker. So are you. You are the expert in your organization when it comes to affirmative action. You are the authority. Know that, believe that, and act accordingly. Establish your authority. Go ahead and tell people. You're likely to hear things come out of my mouth that differ a bit from things you might have heard from Jimmy down at the bar. Now, you know a Jimmy down at the bar. I know you do because pretty much everyone does. Yours may not be named Jimmy, and they might not hang out at a bar, but you know exactly who I'm talking about. Jimmy is a self-proclaimed expert in a lot of things, including affirmative action. Jimmy will happily tell you about how he or a friend of his or a cousin or some guy he knows or his sister's husband's cousin's half-brother who can't get a job because of affirmative action, or was passed over for promotion because of affirmative action, or got fired because of affirmative action. Now, I don't mean to dog on Jimmy. Jimmy can be very entertaining. I don't know, maybe Jimmy owns a truck and is always willing to help a friend move. Jimmy might be great. But when I say something that contradicts the things Jimmy says, I want you to ask yourself, is Jimmy one of the nation's leading experts on affirmative action in the workplace today? Because I am. Does Jimmy have a law degree? Because I do. Has Jimmy committed any formal training or education to affirmative action law? Has he actually helped shape national policy? Because I have. Has Jimmy been published on these topics? Because guess who has? While Jimmy can self-proclaim himself to be an expert in anything, I actually am an expert in affirmative action compliance for employers, and I've got the receipts to prove it. So if you're going to believe anyone who tells you anything about affirmative action, I humbly submit that you should believe me over people like Jimmy. That's the message we need to be sending to our employees. We have to establish our authority. Can it sound obnoxious? Sure, but I'm okay with that, obviously. Go ahead and brag a little, cement it into your audience's mind that what they're hearing is the gospel from on high. And what they hear from others, friends, family, pundits on TV, what have you, is not the gospel. And I like to get another thing out of the way right up front. I don't have a political agenda, and neither do you or your organization. Our personal feelings and opinions do not factor into this in any way, shape, or form. I'm not going to tell you my political affiliation, and I don't assume from what I'm telling you today that you can peg me as a political ideologue. My political views are my own, and they have nothing to do with what I have to say about affirmative action. And the same goes for your company. There is no political agenda here. We are here to talk about the law, and it is the policy of any legitimate organization to obey the law, whether that policy is formally written down or just understood. Your company obeys the law, not some laws, not just the laws we like or feel passionate about. We obey the law, period, hard stop. And if you think the law is being broken, I need you to raise your hand and say something. If you see something you don't like, let's talk about it. That needs to come through loud and clear. This is a matter of the law. A law, by the way, that has stood the test of time for over half a century. And it isn't some obscure law. Everyone knows about it. So there really isn't any excuse. Love it or hate it, or be totally agnostic about it. The law is the law. So we're not here to debate its merits. They already did that extensively in Congress before it was passed with an overwhelming majority and bipartisan support. So this company obeys the law. And the company wants its employees to obey the law too, because when you act in your capacity as a manager or supervisor, or exercising your authority as a recruiter, you act on behalf of the company. And for all intents and purposes, you are the company, which means your words and actions are the company's words and actions. And if those words and actions break the law, it's the company that pays at first. Now, I can't speak on behalf of your employer regarding exactly what would happen should the company land in hot water here, but you can. And I do feel comfortable gently reminding people that being a part of an unexpected, unbudgeted for 6 or 7 figure discrimination settlement is not generally the best path to career success. I don't know how else to put it. I literally don't care what anyone personally thinks about affirmative action. It's the law. Policy requires you to follow the law, and violating company policy can get you canned. And in this moment in history, I think it's important to bring that message back loud and clear. It's not the only message you're going to deliver, but we can't stop with "it's the law." But don't be afraid to lay down the law a little. Carrots are nice and all, but it helps to have a big stick in your back pocket just to make sure you have everyone's attention. We're the vice principals of the organization anyway, aren't we? We already have a reputation for being the bearers of bad news. People already don't like to get surprise visits from HR or legal, which is where compliance is usually anchored. So use that to your advantage. Go ahead and play the part a little. Go ahead and remind people that they don't want to end up on the carpet over this stuff. And go ahead and tell people straight up, if you haven't taken this stuff seriously in the past, now would be a very good time to start. If you have taken this stuff seriously, pay attention anyway, because I guarantee you, just like Jimmy, you don't know as much as you think you do. Oh, hey, by the way, we're not just targeting the resistant here. We have to fold in the true believers too, because they can be just as likely to break the law. They do it thinking it's okay because their intentions are pure, but there's no loophole in the law for good intentions, and it isn't about good or bad anyway, and we'll get to that. The example I use here is Ethan down at the farmer's market. You probably know an Ethan too. He's probably a 20-something white guy with a beard, maybe some attempt at dreads. He wears his shirt with one too many buttons undone and sandals no matter the time of year. And Ethan is just as happy as Jimmy to talk your ear off, only Ethan smugly believes that he is colorblind. And yet Ethan also believes the companies should just stop hiring white guys altogether. For Ethan, the more quote unquote affirmative action, the better. And he's never met an affirmative action initiative that he didn't like. Ethan is just as problematic as Jimmy. Both are dead wrong about what affirmative action is and how it's supposed to work. So we're going to call them out. We're going to recognize that they are out there whispering in our people's ears. And we're going to tell them flat out to ignore Ethan and ignore Jimmy. And we're going to approach this thing by walking straight at it right down the middle of the road. Are you ready? Here we go. First up, what is affirmative action? The term affirmative action has become a very divisive term. You say it, and some people just get their back up. Part of the problem is that when you say affirmative action out loud, about 99% of the population thinks they know what you're talking about, and about 99% of those people are dead wrong because there's so many myths and misperceptions about affirmative action. We have to actively dispel those myths and hold them up in the light of day and look at them and talk about them. And the biggest one has to do with what affirmative action is and is not. And unfortunately, I've seen that myth perpetuated in training courses like these. Lots of people like to start this conversation with what affirmative action is not. And they'll tell you affirmative action is not things like quotas and point systems and set-asides and such. And that's a load of horsepucky. But people might need to be reminded about how a term can mean more than one thing, depending on context. Quotas and point systems and set-asides are absolutely forms or types of affirmative action, and you're excused if you think those are the dominant forms of affirmative action, because when you read about it or see a segment about it on TV, it's always about those forms of affirmative action. So we also need to grasp a concept called reporting bias. That's where people get the impression that something is common because it gets reported on a lot, when that isn't necessarily the case. When you see a story about affirmative action, it always involves something like a quota or a point system, some scheme to let certain people with certain characteristics, quote unquote, jump the line. You see employers, or more likely universities, doing things that sure look a whole lot like taking something from one group and giving it to another. What you don't see, what you never read about, is all the other forms of affirmative action that make up the real day-to-day work. Quotas and point systems and the like do happen, but they are the exception, not the rule. They're actually pretty rare, but that's all anyone sees, so that's what people think affirmative action is. So if it isn't that, or it isn't exclusively that, then what the heck is it? Well, let's take a quick look at Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I know, boring, but stick with me. Knowing a little history can be a good thing. And here's some good things to know. It was passed by a bipartisan Congress. Percentage-wise, it actually had more Republican support than it did Democrat. It was signed into law by a Republican president from Texas who is not known to be particularly progressive in his personal life, and it has been the law of the land for over half a century. Think about all the different power swings in Congress and the White House over half a century. Think of all the opportunities our lawmakers have had to quote unquote fix or eliminate this law, and yet here we are over half a century later, and the law is largely the same as when it was enacted in 1964. And for such a large, seemingly complex piece of legislation, its directive is actually pretty simple. It identifies certain protected characteristics. Name them with me, because everyone knows this familiar laundry list, right? Race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. Title VII makes it illegal to use those characteristics as factors when making employment decisions, period. Hard stop. That's it. That's pretty much all the law says. And there's no affirmative action in the law everyone cites as the reason we have affirmative action. How does that make any sense at all? Well, when the law was originally enacted, you might be surprised to learn that not everyone was immediately on board. And we quickly discovered that posting a carefully worded equal employment opportunity policy in the break room wasn't necessarily enough to unravel 200 plus years of institutional racism, sexism, religious discrimination, etc. Some organizations were against the whole thing. Some organizations were for it well enough, but some of their people weren't always so excited about it. So when people felt like they were still being discriminated against, and now that there was a federal law prohibiting that, they started to sue. And when courts got a look at the shenanigans going on, they realized something. Sometimes the needle is just stuck. People talk about the needle all the time, don't they? We're always trying to move the needle or asking if the needle is moving in the right direction. That's a reference to a needle on a mechanical gauge, like, say, the pressure gauge on a submarine in a World War II movie, right? The captain calls for a reading, and the ensign looks at the gauge, pauses, thinking, that can't be right, then taps on the glass to jostle the needle and get a more accurate reading. Needles move in two directions, either away from something bad and towards something good, or vice versa, so it can be a useful metaphor, shorthand for moving in the right or wrong direction. Now, Title VII is pretty clear. The law says to keep your darn hands off the needle. Moving the needle by direct manipulation, hiring someone because they're a person of color, for instance, is blatantly illegal. Our job isn't to move the needle. Our job is to create an environment in which the needle can move to where it should be on its own, and there's a big difference. So how do we end up with those forms of affirmative action we talked about, like quotas and point systems and set-asides? Well, because sometimes the needle is just stuck. What the federal courts figured out is that sometimes some people are just so resistant to the idea of equality, they will go to extraordinary lengths to maintain the status quo. So like in those World War II submarine movies, sometimes you just have to tap on the glass a little to get the needle unstuck. In other words, there are times when in order to comply with Title VII, you have to violate Title VII. And that idea that you have to break the law to comply with the law does not generally sit well with law-talking people like judges and lawyers. So if it's going to be allowed, it has to be strictly controlled. And it is. Long-standing Supreme Court precedent requires that in order to violate Title VII in the name of Title VII with something like a quota, you have a very high bar to clear. You basically need to show that there is a long-standing systemic or institutional problem with discrimination that cannot be effectively addressed any other way. Basically, you have to try everything else you can think of first that doesn't violate Title VII, and if all else fails, you pick the thing that violates Title VII the least, and you do it for the least amount of time necessary to get the needle unstuck. And if you're so inclined, read up on the history of the NFL's Rooney Rule. See how they likely paid an obscene amount of money for an outside consulting firm to perform a nearly 2-year study of employment practices within the league, and how they concluded from that study that the lack of black head coaches could only be explained by long-standing, deeply entrenched institutional racism in the league. Read about the different ways the NFL tried to address that over the years and failed, and see how they had to set up their justification for essentially violating Title VII in the name of Title VII. And at the end of that kind of painful process, right, after spending a truckload of money to admit publicly that they have a problem with systemic racism, did they institute a quota for hiring black head coaches? No. Did they devise some sort of point system to give black head coaching candidates an edge? No. After all that, all they did was implement a policy that, when hiring for a head coaching position, teams are required to interview at least one black candidate. And that has to be a real interview in which the candidate is given real consideration. But that's all. That's the extent to which they determined it was legal for them to violate Title VII in their attempt to get the needle unstuck. Basically, they implemented a diverse interview slate policy. And that's the groundwork they laid to ensure that it was legal. So think about that. Side note, if your executives have mandated similar diverse interview slate policies and left it to you to figure out how to do it within the confines of the law, the Rooney Rule can be a helpful tool in those discussions, but I digress. Funny thing about the Rooney Rule, it worked. After one team ignored the rule and got fined millions of dollars, the rest of the teams started following the rule, and in just 2 years, the number of black head coaches in the NFL went from 2 to 8. All they did was make sure that a black candidate got into the room and was considered. The teams were free to ultimately hire whomever they chose. And when they considered these candidates, they found they were the best qualified and they hired them. So no one moved the needle, they just got it unstuck so it could move to wherever it needed to be on its own, naturally. And are they done? Is everything in the NFL fixed now? Well, hardly, but they're moving in the right direction, and they're doing it in a way that doesn't force the issue. They're following the law, and it's working. Think for a second about the ripple effects of the rule. 32 teams, 32 head coaches, just 2 black head coaches. Then in a few years, that number quadruples. 3 times as many teams got to experience life with a black head coach. Players got to be coached by them. Assistant coaches got to work for them and be mentored by them. And a whole lot of people got to experience their work life in a way they maybe never did before. That's going to have an impact. And those coaches got those positions not because of the color of their skin. They got those positions because they were actually the best qualified. No one forced anyone to hire anybody. They were chosen. And all they had to do was get in the room. No quotas, no point systems, none of that garbage, because that stuff is harmful, right? Quotas, point systems, set-asides are last-ditch efforts that are always meant to be temporary, which is why they are in reality so rare. So if Jimmy or his cousin or whoever really didn't get hired or promoted because of affirmative action, it means one of 2 things. Either the company is doing it wrong. That's possible. Not everyone can hire the world's best affirmative action lawyers like the NFL can, so sometimes employers just get it wrong. But more likely, it means that the company has done something wrong, and some form of strong affirmative action is required to correct it. Either way, it sucks to be on the losing end of that kind of affirmative action. No need to be shy about that. It's incredibly unfortunate, to put it mildly, if someone loses out on an opportunity because of the color of their skin or their sex. In fact, that's kind of the whole point of the law. So if that is happening because of a settlement or judgment, go ahead and recognize it. Validate those feelings because they're spot on. Try to resist saying things like, "Welcome to the party, pal." Just let them know that, yes, indeed, they are correct. Quotas are bad. And from their perspective, they're on the losing end of that stick, and that just plain sucks. But it also sucks to be on the quote-unquote winning side, if you want to call it that. Women and people of color already know this. You finally get your dream job, but everyone treats you like an affirmative action hire. They assume you got the job because of the color of your skin or your sex, and that necessarily means they don't think you got the job because of your qualifications. And that stain doesn't easily wash off. And it's a heavy, heavy burden to ask people to carry, which is another reason those types of affirmative action are so rare. Congress wrote the law the way they did for a reason. They determined that using someone's race or sex or religion against them is harmful, whether they're male or female or white or black, Christian, Jewish, or agnostic. They and the federal courts that enforce this law understand that when it comes to things like quotas, even when you quote unquote win, you lose. It's just not good for anybody. Sometimes it's necessary for the greater good. So while it might be allowed, it's strictly limited. So we have to ask people to make a distinction between quotas and the like and other forms of affirmative action. And it will be helpful if we refer to quotas and point systems and all that jazz as corrective affirmative action, because that's what it is. So what's the other type? Let's call it preventative affirmative action. I used to call it prophylactic, but the giggles got to be distracting. Preventative affirmative action came about the year after the Civil Rights Act was signed. We realized that a law prohibiting something like discrimination only goes so far, in no small part because enforcement is so difficult. We can either hire and train a literal army of enforcement officers to investigate companies' practices, or we can make the companies do it themselves. Now, the Civil Rights Act was a heavy lift for Congress, and they were tired. more civil rights litigation wasn't likely. But that Republican president from Texas understood that a boatload of employers are also federal contractors, and the federal government is well practiced at tying strings to federal tax dollars. So in 1965, President Johnson signed Executive Order 11246, requiring federal contractor employers to make sure they were complying with Title VII. How? By stepping out of their offices and cubicles and taking a hard look around at their organization. What are they looking for? Well, things that look off is the best way I can describe it. When they look out on the production floor or out over Cubeville, do they see mostly whites, only men? Do they see women or people of color concentrated into certain areas, certain jobs? Do they see workspaces decorated with female pinup models or flyers from the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan? And does that sound like I'm being hyperbolic? Well, in 1965, that sort of thing wasn't so extreme or uncommon, but it is today because federal contractor employers, and there are a lot of them, are engaging in preventative affirmative action. Here, affirmative action simply means making sure that the playing field is even and keeping it that way for everyone. It means making sure non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies are in fact being enforced for everyone. It means making sure the protected characteristics aren't being used as factors when making employment decisions, no matter what those characteristics are. And it means going beyond just posting a policy in the break room and calling it a day. In other words, affirmative action is all about trying to make sure that things like quotas and point systems and set-asides are not and do not become necessary in the first place. It's all about making sure we don't get to the point where those forms of corrective affirmative action are required to unstick our needle. But that kind of affirmative action is boring. It isn't sexy, it doesn't bleed, so it doesn't lead. It doesn't get headlines, and it isn't covered on the evening news, so most people don't know about it. People need to get a handle on what their compliance team is up to, and they need to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. And I guess in this analogy, you're the horse. Sorry about that, but we're not trying to take something from one group and give it to another. We're not trying to make it harder or easier for any particular group to get hired or promoted or to make more money. And we certainly are never going to tell someone to hire more women or hire more people of color or fewer men or fewer whites, because that's not how this works. So is Jimmy wrong when he says his cousin or whoever got passed over because of affirmative action? Well, not necessarily. That might have happened. It might have happened because the company was doing it wrong and it shouldn't have happened. It might have happened because the company did something else wrong and was ordered to implement a quota for a period of time to correct and remedy past misbehavior. And Jimmy's cousin was one of the people who paid the price for that. But that's what we're trying to avoid. The company is taking proactive steps to root out discrimination in any form and eliminate it, making sure that people are hired or not, promoted or not, and compensated based on their actual skills and abilities. They're making sure that people can compete on an even playing field and that the best person wins. And if the playing field is truly even and you lose, it isn't because of affirmative action. It's because you came up against someone with better qualifications, which is the way things I think most people can agree should be. That's a nice little point to keep handy in your pocket if you need it. Some people just need a little punch to the ego to get the point across. What exactly is your big fear about having to compete on an even playing field with others who don't look like you? Are they quote unquote taking your job when they outperform you for it, or are they just outperforming you? In very private conversations with certain people, I might have to step further. For some people, and more have been emboldened here lately, they're just unabashed about their white supremacy views, and that can bleed into the workplace. And guess who gets to deal with that? Us. Yeah. I've had a few of those conversations, and in each case, the person who up to that point was very vocal about their views all of a sudden got real quiet and shy because they ran up against someone who was going to go toe-to-toe with them and speak frankly. And they never expected anyone to talk that way, not at work, for sure, but we did, and it worked. Did we change their mind and win their heart? I don't know, maybe not. But they sure changed their behavior at work, and that's primarily what I'm concerned about. So I also like to encourage people to speak up. That's a refrain we're hearing lately from certain corners, that they feel canceled and they aren't allowed to express their deeply, sincerely held, and in their eyes, legitimate views. And you know what? They're right. To a large extent, the majority of society finds such burning lunacy repugnant. We don't want to hear it. We don't want to see it. Now, I'm not saying to encourage people to wear Nazi armbands to work. That's not what I mean when I like to encourage people to speak up. What I mean is if you see something, say something, whether it's a policy or actual practice. If you don't think it's right, if you don't think it's fair, and certainly if you think it violates the law or your rights somehow, I do want to hear that. This is a conversation we need to have. So raise your hand and ask questions. Stop by my office later if you'd rather do it in private. That's cool, but give your compliance team a chance to explain it to you, because if they're doing it wrong, they need to do it right. And if they're doing it right, your understanding is critical to success. I don't want to shut anyone out of the conversation, but be darn sure I'm not going to make sure, I am going to make sure we're speaking the same language and operating in the same reality. You want to be part of the conversation? Well, it's a two-way street. So let's talk, absolutely. Our organization is committed to equal employment opportunity and affirmative action, and we need everyone's commitment to make it work. We also need to be clear about what we're asking people to commit to. And that is making sure everyone gets a fair shot at work. That's it. It's easier said than done, though, which is why we can't stop there. Let's talk quickly about goals. For people who have ever heard of AAP placement goals, they probably have the exact wrong idea about what's going on there. It's a huge problem, in my opinion, and it stands directly in the way of people getting the right idea about affirmative action. I just got done explaining in excruciating detail how quotas and point systems and such are forms of corrective affirmative action that our affirmative action program is designed to avoid. They're bad things that do harm to people, and someone out there is thinking to themselves, okay, so explain these goals to me then, smarty pants. So let's do that. First, can we just stop using the term goals? We know it gives people the wrong impression. We know they think it's a quota by another name. We know it makes us sound like hypocrites, so why do we use it? Because it's a regulatory term. So what? Where in the OFCCP's regulations does it say that I have to use that term when talking about affirmative action? I'll save you the hassle of combing through the Code of Federal Regulations. It isn't there. Nowhere does it say the term goal or placement goal has to appear in my slide decks, on my required reports, much less in my conversations. Yet in an audit, we're going to want to use the nomenclature that the OFCCP uses when talking to them, but outside of that context, we're not required to use that stupid term. Placement goals are not goals, at least not in the way most people think of that term. A goal is something you try to achieve in the moment. If my goal is to hire women into a particular job group at a rate of 63%, then while I'm hiring, I'm trying to hire women, or at least enough women to meet that goal. That is a quota, and it's illegal, and that's not what we do. A goal simply means that we have observed a suspicious difference in demographics when we look at what we actually have compared to what we think we could or should have based on some pretty shaky data from the US Census Bureau, and that's it. It just means that a certain group appears to be underutilized. We don't know yet whether or not that's actually the case. We don't know if the difference in demographics is due to discrimination. The hiring IRAs will give us a clue there, but let's assume that's not an issue. We just have to set a placement goal as per the regulations. There could be any number of reasons for that difference in demographics that have nothing to do with wrongdoing. In fact, statistically, it's far more likely to have to do with something other than discrimination. But we just don't know. And we rarely, if ever, have any concrete proof one way or the other. So we have to go through this process of elimination to make sure that whatever the reason is, it isn't something the company is doing or not doing that we should be doing. And that's the crux of it. Goals are just investigatory tools. They're like survey markers that we plant in areas where we need to take a closer look and make sure nothing hinky is going on. Either we find an actual problem and we fix it, or we build up the document evidence we need to defend ourselves if and when someone files a charge. Either way, everybody wins. So why, oh why, did they have to call them goals? People hear the word goal and they think quota. If they're exposed to the goal report and see the goal expressed as the availability percentage, as they will because your reports are compliant, they're perfectly capable of doing the simple math required to turn that percentage into a head count based on the number of people they anticipate hiring in the coming year. And if they don't have the math skills for even that, they're carrying around a supercomputer in their pocket with internet access, so they can probably figure it out, and they will. Especially if we're tying performance to placement goals. Please don't do that either. Tie it to their effort, not the results. If someone breaks the law because they misunderstood what we're asking, that's likely where it'll end. But if they break the law because it looks like we encourage them to do so, we have a whole other kettle of fish to deal with. But the term itself encourages people to break the law. to treat it like a quota. Now, Ethan might think that's a good thing, but Ethan's a moron. We've already explained a couple of ways that quotas are bad, but here's another for the cheap seats. Quotas often become ceilings. I have a female placement goal of 60%. I plan on hiring 10 people in the coming year, so I think 6 of those hires had better be women, or else I'm going to be in trouble. So what do? I hire exactly 6 women. And good luck being the 7th, even if you're the best qualified, because I met my quota and I'm done looking at female applicants. Using the term goal gives people all the wrong ideas, and in doing so, it damages our credibility. They think we're saying that we have quotas, but we can't call them quotas. So use the term goal and everything's fine, but it's not fine. So what should we call them instead? Nothing. Don't give it a name. When talking about your AAP, talk about your action plans. If you must talk about utilization, you'll need to do some verbal gymnastics, sure, but if I can do it, so can you. Don't give goals the honor of being a thing with a name. We have identified areas in our organization where the demographics would seem suspiciously off to an outside observer. So we have to do some things to make sure we can explain that. The things we do are contained in an action plan. So let's look at that. I don't care how you do it, just stop talking about goals. You'll thank me for it. Let's talk briefly about hoops. No, this isn't a regulatory term, it's a perception, and a commonly held one at that. There are lots of hoops we have to jump through to hire someone at this company, and it's so annoying. And I pride myself at figuring out shortcuts and ways to circumvent that system. Hoops are unnecessary, annoying things standing in the way of our objective. That's how people view your hiring process with your job listing reviews and interview panels and outreach efforts and interview sheets, etc. People see them as hoops to get around. And that is a ship we need to turn around, especially with hiring managers and recruiters. We have to help people understand why the hoops, quote unquote, are in place to begin with in order for them to stop seeing them as hoops. And yes, many of them are in place to cover the company's rear end. And that's okay to admit, actually, because their rear end might be on the line too. So those hoops cover them as well. Hiring and promoting and setting pay, and particularly terminations, are high-risk activities for an employer. They are ripe for allegations of improper behavior in one form or another. So yes, some of the things you're asked to do in these processes are designed primarily to cover our collective derrieres. Great. Okay, well, now I know it, I at least understand, and the hoop is looking less and less like a hoop to me to get around and something more like something I need to pay attention to. Maybe the hoop is designed to allow us more insight into the process, specifically so we can know if something is going on that shouldn't be. That's okay to admit too. People tend to pay closer attention when they know others are looking or coming in behind them to review their work. Applicant dispositioning is a great example. It's a system that's kind of hard to game without flat out lying, and most people shy away from taking things quite that far. They're limited to the dispositions you provide. So there isn't a lot of horsing around people can do in the first place. We just need them to actually do it, right? We need complete applicant dispositions. Once we have that, we can drill down and see if people are being lazy using go-to dispositions that don't really give us much to go on, and we can make adjustments there. Because the other side of the disposition coin is accuracy. Take it a step at a time and go ahead and let people know that this is a performance issue and could become a legal issue. Kill 2 birds with 1 stone. The more complete and accurate your dispositions are, the better your performance is going to be rated, and the less likely it is you'll end up in an alleged discrimination mess. Now, they have 2 motivations because we took the time to explain it to them, which kind of leads me to documentation in general. Documentation is everything. There are basically 2 schools of thought when it comes to documenting our employment selection procedures. One school of thought is the less documentation, the better, because there's less chance of someone producing hard evidence of wrongdoing that we can't ignore or work around. And yes, that's a risk. But if that's what you're worried about, aren't we kind of admitting to already knowing or at least suspecting that we have a problem? I'm sure that won't ever come back to bite anyone in the tuchus. The other school of thought understands the multi-purpose nature of documentation. For one, it's your best defense. The number one reason most organizations end up in the stinky soup of a hiring or compensation discrimination settlement is not because the organization actually discriminated against anyone, it's because they were unable to prove it. And they were unable to prove it. Why were they unable to prove it? Well, lack of documentation. The greatest challenge when it comes to hiring and compensation discrimination investigations is that by the time we get to looking at what happened, we're usually 2 or more years down the road. A lot can happen in 2 years. People leave for other employers, people retire, people die. Institutional knowledge is lost or scattered to the wind. And the name of the game is being able to pinpoint why this or that person was hired and why this or that person was not hired, or why we chose to set this person's compensation here in this strata and this other person's pay in some other strata. And in my experience, there are usually perfectly reasonable, non-discriminatory reasons for these things, but the problem is proving it. The more we make people document their thought process, the better off we are, more times than not, when it comes time to defend those decisions. And if you have someone who writes down in their interview notes, "I don't like Black people," well, that's not good exactly, but I'd rather know about that person and their views sooner rather than later, so I can deal with that before things go completely out of hand. But the documentation's not just a gotcha exercise. That's not what we're hoping for. It's actually a very valuable tool for the decision maker themselves. When people have to put into words and write down their thought process, they have to face that thought process. And when they know other people are going to read it, they're more likely to see it through your eyes and take that into account. But they will see their decision making on the page, and they will see where the reasoning is thin, and they know someone from compliance may be coming in and will complain to them that so they're going to want to shore that up, right? You're thinking, but they're also likely to try to just tell me what I want to hear. People are adept at hiding their true thinking and just jotting down what they think they're supposed to say. True enough. But those people are not usually as clever as we give them credit for. In my experience, they reveal themselves pretty quickly by relying on stock phrasing that they view as magic words. You can spot it pretty quickly and follow up with them. What do you mean by this person being a better fit? Why don't you think this person would be a team player or didn't seem interested or engaged? How? Let them know that boilerplate language isn't going to cut it, and they'll find it harder and harder to hide the truth. But we're talking about the fringe here, I hope. I hope your organization isn't full of devious racists anyway. If it is, good luck to you and give me a call later, but it probably isn't. Most people are trying to do a good job and get ahead. Most people want to do right, I think, I hope. But if we can get them to document, we can use the documentation itself in the moment as an anti-discrimination tool. Don't just write stuff down, write it down and review it. Ask yourself, am I making assumptions here? Ask yourself, if someone else came in behind me and reviewed all of this, would they come to the same conclusions? Maybe there's a suspicious difference in demographics in my department that I know compliance is concerned about, or maybe worse, the hiring IRAs have come back hot, and I know people are scrutinizing the process and the decisions. Let's make sure the problem isn't me, right? Let's make sure the documentation reflects that so I don't get a visit from the vice principal. Now, I want to wrap up with encouraging us all to cut ourselves some slack. Most people are not unabashed, racist, and sexist pigs. If you find yourself dealing with one of those, we'll deal with it appropriately. But it isn't going to happen very often, and that really oversimplifies things. People are way more complicated than that. There are lots of things people do and say because that's the way they've seen and heard other people do it. They haven't necessarily researched the origin or the phrase they use as a shorthand in conversation or given serious consideration to why they react to certain things the way they do. And it can be really embarrassing for people to learn that something they've been saying or doing all this time is considered bad or harmful or shameful. It can cause stress, anxiety, depression. It can cause people to get defensive and double down. The reality is we're all just people, and people are flawed. We're going to get it wrong once in a while. We just are. I do. And thinking about this stuff is literally what I do for a living. Most people are just trying to get by, earn a living, provide for their families, and maybe go to Disneyland once in a while. Maybe drive a car they're not embarrassed to be seen in. And what might have been socially acceptable yesterday can seem to turn on a dime these days. Now, that's usually because we were just insensitive yesterday. Not that it wasn't wrong or hurtful or offensive, but it can seem to people like that at any moment. They can be attacked and called out for something they never knew was a problem, and that's scary. Throw in that they might get in trouble for it at work, and you get all sorts of surprising reactions out of otherwise reasonable seeming people. Wokeness has become such a divisive concept these days, I think, because we're framing it wrong. We're all perpetuating this idea that there are some people who are woke, and they are good people, and there are other people who are not woke, and those are bad people because they should be woke, or at least want to be. So we framed it as good versus bad. And we framed it as a state of being that one can achieve. Look, I don't care who you are. No one I've ever met is quote unquote woke. At best, they are in a constant state of waking up. That's my best case scenario. That's what I shoot for personally, becoming more sensitive, learning more, changing with the times. When I meet someone who thinks they've already arrived, thinks that they have all the answers, well, let's just say I'm skeptical. We need to cut ourselves some slack here. I don't need you to get it right all the time. I just need you to try. Can we start there? Because we're all at least a little bit ist, whether that's racist or sexist. Don't even get me started on religion. These are just this is basic human nature. We're all hardwired to trust things that are familiar and to be skeptical of things that are unfamiliar. It's literally how our species has survived. It's a basic animal instinct that you don't just drop at some point. But the law requires us to counter that base instinct. I'm not familiar with Hispanic culture. I'm just not. I didn't grow up around it, and I never made an effort to understand it better. So when I'm going through a stack of applications and I see one from Maria Hernandez, her world is unfamiliar to me. I have trouble relating with her. I'm going to naturally worry that we're too different to work well together, and I'm probably going to make a whole lot of assumptions about her based on what? I don't know anything about being Hispanic in America. I don't really know anything about the culture. I don't really have any Hispanic friends, so I'm probably making assumptions about her based on popular culture and news coverage. I don't hate Hispanic people. I don't dislike them. I don't think I have derogatory opinions about them in general that I'm consciously aware of. I'm just a guy who grew up in Kansas where most people looked and sounded and acted like me. And here's this person who's different from me, and my base instinct is to be skeptical. What am I supposed to do as a hiring manager? Try to ignore that she's Hispanic? Well, good luck with that. No, it's far better for me to be able to admit that I might be biased. So I need to review her application with more care, not giving her an advantage over other people, not assessing her differently, but to make sure I'm actually treating her the same. That can be hard for people to wrap their heads around. I have to treat this applicant differently in order to ensure I'm treating them the same. But that's exactly what I'm saying. If I have permission to do that, to take a closer look with a more self-critical eye when I'm dealing with someone different than myself, I'm a huge step closer to achieving our goal. The next step is actually to do the same thing with applicants who are familiar and like me because they look like me. Am I making assumptions about them out of that familiarity? If I do that, pretty soon, I'm shutting out the noise so I can focus on actual skills, experience, and education, actual qualifications for the job, because it's become a habit. Because I know that my assumptions might be getting in the way, one way or the other, so I have to shut them out. One of my absolute favorite audit stories, and I have a few, ask me sometime about the Las Vegas hotel and casino audit, but one of my favorite stories involved a hiring manager who was in the hot seat in an audit being interviewed by the OFCCP compliance officer. The hiring iris looked really bad. So did the utilization analyses, and the compliance officer had zeroed in on a few hiring decisions in particular. They'd reviewed the application and other data and information, then just wasn't seeing a difference between who was selected and who was not, except for their race. So they started in on the hiring manager, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, "Yeah, I saw that too. Our compliance team reviews this stuff pretty regularly, I guess, and they'd asked me about past decisions before. So I'm looking at the stack of applications and I'm doing my documentation." Right then and there, I could have kissed the guy, but I controlled myself. He said, "I went to fill in all the forms and stuff we have to do, and I got worried. I started to question my reasons, and I was worried that I was going to cause a problem." "So what did you do next?" the compliance officer asked naively. He said, "I asked HR for a second read." Yeah. It turns out the guy went to HR and said he was concerned that he was hiring people based on their race. He actually said that out loud to someone in HR. Then he asked if someone could take a look at his slate and tell him who they think stands out and why, so that they can compare notes. And it was the darndest thing I'd ever seen. I wasn't actually involved in the prep for that interview. I was pretty junior then, and I was pretty much there just to take notes, and I had no idea what was coming. He said, "Yeah, I was worried about that too, so I got a second read from the people who are tasked with legal compliance in this area." Now, is that a perfect fail-safe? No, there's no such thing. If you're like me, you're probably wondering about the sex and race ethnicity of the HR professional who gave that second read. And you're also probably wondering how qualified they were to make that determination, since they don't actually do that job or manage the people they do. But the point is, the guy felt comfortable enough to say he didn't think he was getting it right and to ask for help. He took HR up on their own open door policy, and it turns out the HR professional came to the same conclusions that he did, and they were comfortable that they were extending offers to the best candidates. And if that made the numbers look bad or worse, so be it. And it isn't that exactly what we want people to do? But the only way that happens is if we give them permission, not the my door is always open kind, but real permission to be a real human being with flaws and doubts and vulnerabilities. Someone instilled in that guy how important this stuff is and how getting it right is more important than any discomfort he feels in the process. And I wish I could replicate that. I'm trying to replicate that as much as possible. And I want you to have the tools to talk to your people about these things, like I have today. Sometimes in frank terms, sometimes in scary terms, but mostly with love and understanding and compassion. Some of what I've said today may sound harsh, but it's meant to be delivered in the way a family member delivers harsh news. There's things that we need to talk about and deal with, but it doesn't mean I love you any less. It doesn't mean the end of your career. In fact, depending on how you react to our conversation, it could end up meaning being the thing that jumpstarts your career, because when we have someone we know we can rely on to be conscious of non-discrimination concerns and to be humble enough to be honest with themselves and ask for help, that's the stuff leaders are made of. Those are the people who will go far. We're not going to punish people for being human, but there are consequences for breaking the law. So people need to know they're getting the straight dope from us, that they can trust us, that they know we're on their side and that we're here to help, not to play gotcha. So that's what I'm trying to help you do. I hope this is only the start of the conversation. So if you have thoughts, feelings, questions, concerns, hit me. Rathan, are you still there?
Hi, yeah, thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. I hope you all enjoyed. We went a little bit over our time, but that's okay. There will be a recording of this presentation. We won't have time for Q&A, so please send any questions to either Matt or to me. I would make sure we get all the answers and we send them to you. As I said, a PDF of the presentation will be sent to you. Make sure that you add contact@JOBfindah.com to your safe email list. The webinar is also approved for 1 hour of credit by HRCI. We will send you the information. So once again, many thanks to Matt. I hope you all enjoyed, and we will be in touch for our next webinar soon. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.
The webinar ends right now.